Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Alright, so let's talk about something that honestly didn't get nearly enough attention in mainstream US media, but might end up being one of the most consequential global governance experiments of the decade. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Donald Trump oversaw the launch of a new international body called the Board of Peace. On the surface, it sounds like just another diplomatic initiative, but once you dig into the structure, the funding model, the membership rules, and most importantly, who controls it, this starts to look like something much bigger. Some people are calling it visionary, others are calling it dangerous, and a few are calling it Trump's attempt to build a personal rival to the United Nations. So instead of reacting emotionally, let's slow down and walk through what this actually is. What problem it claims to solve, why some countries are intrigued, why others are alarmed, and what this might mean for the future of global power. Originally, this Board of Peace came out of Trump's Gaza peace plan. The early idea was relatively limited: create a transitional international body that would help govern Gaza, manage reconstruction, oversee funding, and eventually hand power back to a reformed Palestinian Authority, all under some level of UN authorization. That version sounded like a temporary conflict-specific institution. But the final charter that went out to world leaders looks very different. This is no longer just about Gaza. The Board of Peace is now framed as a standing international organization with a broad mission: promoting stability, restoring governance, and securing peace in conflict-affected regions anywhere in the world. In other words, this isn't a one-off task force. It's designed as a permanent player in global conflict management. Now here's where things get interesting and controversial. The charter explicitly names Donald Trump as the inaugural chairman, not just as US president, but as an individual. There are no clear term limits. The rules for replacing him are narrow. The selection of successors is heavily influenced by him. Membership, invitations are controlled by him. Renewals of member states' terms depend on him. So structurally, this is not a typical multilateral organization where power is diffused across states. It's a highly centralized governance model, and Trump sits at the center of it. That alone explains why people are uneasy. But to be fair, there is also a logic behind this design. Supporters of Trump's approach would argue something like this: the UN is slow, the UN is bureaucratic, the UN Security Council is paralyzed by veto politics, peacekeeping missions get bogged down, resolutions stall, funding is inconsistent, and when crises happen, Syria, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, the international response often feels fragmented and ineffective. So Trump's pitch, implicitly or explicitly, is: what if we built something faster, more decisive, more action-oriented, and less constrained by endless multilateral gridlock? In that framing, centralizing authority isn't a bug, it's a feature. From that perspective, the Board of Peace is meant to function more like a CEO-led crisis response organization rather than a consensus-driven parliament. You can see how that would appeal to certain governments, especially those frustrated with UN inertia. Now, let's talk about money, because the funding model is one of the most unusual parts of this entire project. Member states serve 3-year terms, but if a country contributes more than $1 billion in cash within the first year, they can secure a permanent seat. That effectively creates a pay-to-lock-in influence system. Some people see this as pragmatic. If you want real commitment, require real financial buy-in. Others see it as troubling. It risks turning global peace governance into a club for wealthy states. Again, neither interpretation is purely irrational, but they reflect very different visions of how international power should be structured. Then there's the executive board. It includes political figures, Trump allies, international financiers, former heads of government, and people deeply connected to diplomacy, business, and real estate. Critics say this looks like an elite power network. Supporters would say, these are people with real influence, real resources, and real capacity to get things done. And this tension between efficiency vs legitimacy is one of the central themes here. Now, what about who's joining? Roughly 60 countries were invited, some accepted, including countries that have direct stakes in Middle East stability, countries friendly to Trump, and countries previously involved in Trump-era peace efforts. Others declined or hesitated, particularly in Europe. France, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Slovenia all raised concerns. Germany and Italy expressed legal and constitutional doubts. The UK has been cautious. Ukraine raised concerns about Russia and Belarus being included. And that last point matters. The presence of Russia, and especially Belarus, sends a signal. To some countries, it looks like pragmatic realism. If you want peace deals, you need to talk to difficult actors. To others, it looks like normalization of authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, none of the other permanent members of the UN Security Council have fully embraced the project, and that tells you something important. Because if you're France, Russia, or China, you might reasonably ask, why would we weaken a UN system where we already have veto power in favor of a new structure dominated by the United States? And more specifically, by Trump. So there's a real institutional self-interest at play here. Now, here's the big underlying fear that keeps coming up. Is this a rival to the United Nations? Trump has publicly said the Board of Peace would work with the UN, not replace it. And to be fair, that could be true in theory. But critics point to a few things. Trump has repeatedly criticized the UN. The US has withdrawn from multiple UN bodies under his leadership. The board's branding, even its logo, visually echoes UN symbolism, but with a US-centered emphasis. And the funding model could potentially siphon money away from already underfunded UN programs. So the anxiety is not just about Trump as a person. It's about a broader shift in global governance, away from slow multilateral consensus toward faster, power-centric coalition models. Now let's talk about corruption concerns, because this is where the criticism gets sharper. There are billions of dollars potentially flowing into a fund that Trump, directly or indirectly, has major influence over. Supporters say financial oversight mechanisms will be implemented. Skeptics point to Trump's business history, real estate ties, and the involvement of investors who have openly discussed the development potential of Gaza. To be clear, there's a difference between proven corruption and structural corruption risk. Right now, much of the concern falls into the second category. It's not necessarily saying wrongdoing has already happened. It's saying the incentive structure creates a risk that needs strong safeguards. That's a legitimate policy concern, not a conspiracy theory. But here's where I think the conversation often goes wrong. A lot of coverage frames this as, is Trump trying to grab more power? That might be part of the story. But the bigger story is this. We're watching a potential experiment in rebuilding global governance outside the traditional uncentered model. And that experiment reflects deeper trends, rising frustration with UN inefficiency, growing competition between great powers, declining faith in universal multilateralism, a shift toward coalitions, clubs, and power blocks, and yes, a push toward more centralized leadership structures. So instead of treating this as a Trump personality drama, it might be more accurate to see it as part of a structural transition in how global power is organized. Trump isn't creating that transition alone. He's tapping into forces that already exist. Now, let's be fair to the positive case for this project. Even if you're skeptical, a supporter might argue, what if this actually helps resolve conflicts faster? What if it cuts through UN deadlock? What if it mobilizes funding more efficiently? What if it creates a new toolkit for post-war reconstruction? What if it works as a complement, not a replacement, to the UN? Those are legitimate questions. The UN does have real problems. Peacekeeping can be slow. Security Council politics can freeze action. And many people, across the political spectrum, agree that reform is overdue. So the Board of Peace could be seen not just as a power grab, but as a provocative reform experiment. The real issue is not whether it sounds bold. The real issue is how it's governed. Who holds it accountable? How transparent is it? Who audits it? Who checks abuses? What happens if leadership changes? What happens if political incentives shift? That's where this becomes less about ideology and more about institutional design, because centralized power can be efficient, but without strong oversight, it can also become dangerous. So if you zoom out, here's the balanced takeaway. This isn't just Trump being Trump. This is part of a larger struggle over the future of global order. Do we stick with slow, consensus-based multilateralism? Do we shift toward faster, power-driven coalitions? Can we build new institutions that are both efficient and accountable? Or are we entering an era where global governance becomes more fragmented and personalized? The Board of Peace might succeed. It might fail, it might fade into irrelevance, or it might reshape how international conflict management works. But one thing is clear. This is not a trivial side project. It's a real experiment in power, legitimacy, and global authority. And whether you love Trump, hate Trump, or feel mixed about him, this is a story worth paying attention to, because it goes far beyond any single politician. Thanks for watching.